Field modifications are a common feature of the battlefield. These have taken on many forms over the decades, with anything from bed frames to flamethrowers being fitted to tanks in an attempt to increase their combat capabilities or protection. One of these many methods was the use of concrete to increase protection for the tank. In this video, we'll be discussing the effectiveness and history surrounding tanks with concrete armor with the help of a special guest.
Throughout history, there have been countless tanks, all designed to kill. But not all have been a success. What happened to the ones that never made it, and why did they fail? My name is ConeOfArc. Join me as we journey through time, uncovering failed projects and forgotten creations in Cursed by Design.
Modifying tanks is a tough business, and it's important to keep hydrated while you do so. But the last thing you want after hours of backbreaking labor mixing concrete is to drink lukewarm water. Conveniently, today's sponsor has the solution. The coldest water ensures that no matter what task you're up to, you'll always have a nice cold bottle of water waiting for you for over 36 hours. Not only that, but every bottle comes with a money-back guarantee for up to a year, so there's absolutely no risk to try it. I highly recommend these bottles, and as a special offer to my viewers, you can get one of these with a 10% discount by using the code CONE at checkout. Not only will it keep you refreshed with the coldest water, but you directly support videos like this. Now let's get into the video. I do need to make a quick disclaimer before we start, however. Due to the fact that the majority of these tanks are field modifications, as I mentioned in the beginning, there isn't a huge amount of readily available information about them, so I'll be doing my best to give you as much as I can find. I'll also be limiting this video's scope to World War II tanks, although I may make a follow-up video talking about more modern implementations of concrete and other strange modifications. To start with, we'll talk about what is probably the most successful use of concrete, which I believe to be that of the Sturmgeschütz. By the late stages of the war, the Stug's protection had begun to lessen as more powerful guns were fielded. Despite numerous upgrades to the armor of the tank, it's understandable that many crews would still have taken anything they could get to make themselves feel just a little bit safer. This led to many crews adding concrete to the superstructure of their vehicles. Both the Germans and Finns are known to have done this, with one of the most famous examples being a Finnish Stug, or Styrmi as they were called, which is on display at Bovington. These modifications varied in placement and thickness, but the majority were added along the upper front of the superstructure, which gave the Stug a very rounded look thanks to the smooth concrete. Although not as effective as armor plate, the concrete did slightly increase the survivability of the tanks, and it had the benefit of being far cheaper and easier to acquire than the rapidly shrinking supplies of steel. Often these tanks also carried some sort of extra plating on the sides to protect from anti-tank rifles, some even using logs, which could also be used if the machine became stuck. As with anything though, the added weight increased strain on the transmission and other drive components. Whether this severely impacted the reliability of the vehicles is unclear, since as I mentioned earlier, information on this topic isn't the most detailed. Regardless though, the crew must have felt that it was at least better than nothing, as there are no shortage of photos showing Stugs with concrete, including a captured one being used by the Americans. For the next tank, I'll be passing it over to our special guest, my friend Pompom. She has a bit of an obsession with the T-34, so I'll pass you over to her for this next one.
As early as 1941, a program to increase the T-34s Armor to 60mm was under development. This led to what is known as the Shielded T-34, which saw limited production from 1941 through 1942. However, the outbreak of the war shifted focus from these up-armored tanks in favor of just making a bunch more tanks. Although Soviet command was likely more than happy to continue sending swarms of T-34s with weaker armor if it meant higher production numbers, as the war slogged on, other attempts were made to make these poor tanks less vulnerable. One of these attempts was from a designer by the name of Zyuganov. At first, they tried to pour concrete directly onto the armor. Tests reportedly showed that this increased the chance of ricochets from blunt projectiles. However, it was a time-consuming process to get the cement onto the tank since that had to be done by hand. In their next attempt to make concrete a viable option, they welded a steel structure onto the hull and turret of the T-34. They would then use this frame to attach pads of reinforced concrete. Some sources say that they also tried a method of mounting the concrete directly to the armor plates, but no photos exist of these. The photos that have survived shows two different tanks with added concrete. Another material experimented with was known as ice concrete. By installing a frame of wood to the tank, materials like sawdust or gravel could be added with water, which would then freeze. Reportedly, this is actually able to stop a German Pak-40 to the side of the tank with a thickness of only 80mm of the mixture. Unsurprisingly, this bizarre idea was never adopted due to some of the major issues it caused to the tank. The concrete added an enormous amount of weight to the tank, with most sources indicating as much as 4 tons. This would have resulted in issues with the mobility of the T-34. Although this was a relatively cheap alternative to using steel plates like the shielded T-34 used, it would have increased the protection by a similar amount. No production was ever seen, although the prototypes could possibly have seen use. After these various projects flopped, Saganov would go on to work with plastics and other materials in attempts to find a cheaper alternative to steel. This would be one of the earliest examples of a type of composite armor being tested. Hello, my name's Pom Pom, I'm Cone's friend, and I'm starting my very own tank history channel with him called TankParty. My first video is going to be an in-depth presentation on the history and performance of the T-34-57, one of my favorite tanks. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for sharing that funky design with us, Pom. Hopefully we can have you back in a future video. With that out of the way, we're left with the last documented use of concrete in World War II I could find. As with the other countries, the US tried multiple methods to increase their tank survivability, such as sandbags or even salvaged armor like on the Super Pershing. Sandbags were eventually found to not increase the protection by a significant amount while still adding weight and strain to the tank's internals. This resulted in the crews turning to the next easily accessible material. Since these were entirely field modifications, there's no definitive way that the crews added the concrete to the tanks, but I can give you some examples. The most common in the European theater was to just pour the concrete directly onto the armor. Although this did not entirely prevent penetration by enemy warheads, it did reportedly reduce the effectiveness of them if they hit. This resulted in a higher survival chance for the crew and was a quite common modification by the later days of the war. Reportedly, the 750th Tank Battalion had to spend hours using jackhammers to remove up to 6 inches of concrete from their tanks at the end of the war before turning their tanks in. A photo even exists of concrete being added to a Sherman Jumbo. This was likely more to protect it from Panzerfausts and other infantry anti-tank weapons than against other tanks though. There also exists a photo of an M26 Pershing with concrete poured onto the whole front. The European theater wasn't the only battlefield that saw the use of concrete though. Tankers in the Pacific also experimented with various ways to use it. This was partly to protect against the Japanese 47mm, which could destroy a Sherman through its relatively weak sides. By attaching wooden boards along the side with a gap which was then filled with concrete, the crew could be better protected. This also had the benefit of preventing magnetic mines from being attached to the tank. This was far from the only interesting way the crews tried to protect their tanks from Japanese infantry, and I may do a deeper dive into this topic in the future, so let me know if that sounds interesting to you. However, once again, the concrete proved problematic due to the increased weight, especially considering these tanks had to be transported in naval craft after their use on the various islands, not to mention the much more difficult terrain posed by the islands themselves. So what can we learn from all of these different uses of concrete? In some uses, it clearly was a good way to at the very least make the crews feel a little more secure, which would help with morale. But in reality, it would do very little to actually protect the tank from an enemy tank or tank destroyer. Infantry anti-tank weapons were a bit of a different story, and it certainly helped against things like magnetic mines. As with most projects to increase a tank's protection though, it posed more of a hazard to the tank's drivetrain and mobility than it was probably worth. Thanks so much to Pom Pom for helping out on this video. Please do go check out her channel if you like this video. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you enjoyed this video, and if you did, why not go watch the entire playlist that will be popping up on your screen right now. Thanks once again to the Coldest Water for sponsoring the episode, and I hope to see you in the next video.